In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. We've come to Sexagesima Sunday. In the traditional calendar and sacred liturgy, we are marking already days of increasing penance and focus that will lead into the sacred season of Lent. So we have some extended weeks of preparation, has been the traditional practice. And for my sermon, I want to focus principally upon the first lesson of this Mass of Sexagesima Sunday. It is a text from St. Paul the Apostle's second epistle to the Christian community at Corinth, 2 Corinthians. This is one of those communities that was particularly troublesome for the apostle. He had to deal with, among other issues, serious immorality, division within the community, and ultimately challenges to his own apostolic authority. And it is this last matter, challenges to his authority as an apostle and founder of that community, as a missionary, that is addressed in the first lesson of this Mass. We have to reconstruct from the epistle and from what we know of other New Testament writings and perhaps some extra biblical writings, what was happening. But it seems clear that what occasioned St. Paul writing this text or the lesson of today very much related to the activity of those who were challenging or even denying his apostleship, perhaps pseudo-apostles themselves or lesser apostles who were preaching some gospel other than that of St. Paul, other than that of the authentic gospel. So he was confronting, for the sake of his community, false apostles and a false gospel which they preached. So much was at stake. And this occasioned St. Paul not only listing his own credentials, which I'm sure in his own great humility was a personal burden for him, but he established his credibility, his credentials, his resume, if you will, as an authentic descendant of the Hebrew people and a minister of Christ. Speaking of these pseudo-apostles, he asked rhetorically, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I, speak as a fool, am more. I am more. More than a minister, he is an apostle. And then the great apostle St. Paul goes on with a litany or a list. It's sometimes been nicknamed the fool's list. Not that St. Paul was any sort of fool, but in humility he describes himself as foolish for the sake of Christ. He goes on to list a number of things that he has suffered as an apostle, which he regards as a sign of his authentic apostleship and a share in the sufferings of Christ. We read, I have suffered with many more labors, in prisons more frequently, in lashes above measure, often exposed to death. From the Jews, 5 times I received 40 lashes less one. Thrice I was scourged, once I was stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I was adrift on the sea, in journeys often, in perils from floods, in perils from robbers, in perils from my own nation, in perils from the Gentiles, in perils from the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in sea, in perils from false brethren, in labor and hardships, and many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Besides those outer things, there is my daily pressing anxiety, the care of all the churches. It's a very impressive list. And after this, St. Paul goes on not only to speak about his hardships here on earth in what we call the church militant, but also the mystical experiences that he has had, mystical in a sense, touching upon the church triumphant. As I read through this litany of sufferings that were a demonstration of his authentic apostleship and the authenticity of the gospel that he preached, I thought that we traditional Catholics could have our own list. A list of what has been suffered collectively, in many cases individually, for the past 50 years by those who have been within the traditional church for the past 50 years at least. Here is our list, our litany, the credentials of true Catholicism. We, traditional Catholics, that is, authentic Catholics, had the traditional Mass and sacraments stripped from us. We have been abandoned by priests and religious. We have had our Catholic schools and hospitals compromised and closed. We have had our musical organs abandoned in favor of guitars and drums. We have been refused Holy Communion on the tongue and on our knees. We have been treated like lepers. We have had to travel great distances to find a traditional Mass. We have had to seek asylum from sympathetic bishops and priests to have our children sacramentally confirmed. We have had to cross from parish to parish, diocese to diocese, and from state to state to find the traditional sacraments. We have had to have Masses in secret and sometimes in secular settings. And we have been insulted and called undeserved names from the highest level of the church hierarchy. Names that include rosary counters, self-absorbed Promethean Neopelagians, restorationists, ideological Christians, triumphalists, rigid Christians, modern Gnostics, slaves of superficiality, museum mummies, Renaissance princes, ideologues, authoritarians, elitists, pickled pepper-faced Christians, closed, sad, trapped Christians, creed-reciting parrot Christians, inquisitorial beaters, fundamentalists, and moralist quibblers. And the list goes on. I suggest that as St. Paul provided his resume, his list of sufferings for the authentic gospel, and so traditional Catholics can present their credentials, their list of sufferings, collectively at least, for the sake of the authentic church. We must not lose charity to include against those who would insult us and seek to shut us down and exclude us from the church. But we should be reminded, as did St. Paul, that suffering for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of Christ, the authentic gospel, and the true Christ involves suffering. Sometimes great suffering, and for a long time. But let us conclude with the words and the sentiments of St. Paul, who, after providing his list of sufferings, says this and tells us, "Let us glory in our sufferings, that the power of Christ may dwell in us." In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost.